Is Central Asia getting a new country? This is a story that you're really not seeing anywhere. And while that might be because it's not really that relevant, I think it might be more relevant than we think. Today we associate Central Asia with the Istans, right? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And it is inside this last one, Tajikistan, that a new country might emerge. And don't worry, it doesn't break the name trend. It would be called Badakhshan. I guess that kind of does break the name trend. It's not an Istan, it just ends with an. So, I don't know. You can look at it whichever way you prefer. So, where even is this place? Here is Tajikistan. Now, if we take almost half of the country's territory in the east, you get Gorno-Badakhshan, the largest autonomous region of the country, located in the Pamir Mountains. That's actually what the name means. Gorno just comes from the Russian word gorny for mountainous. It literally means mountainous Badakhshan. Badakhshan itself is older and more interesting. It is traced back to a Sasanian Middle Persian title, Bedaks, which was some kind of high official, a governor, or maybe like a viceroy of a region. The Persian suffix an means land of or place of. So Badakhshan is basically the land belonging to the Badaksh, a governor's domain that turned into a place name. So the full name, Gorno-Badakhshan, is basically the mountainous part of the governor's land, if you will. Today, it makes up 45% of Tajikistan's land area, but population-wise, only a minuscule 2%. Its capital city is Korog, a town established in 1932, but which can trace its origins to Russian imperial fortifications. It's down by the border with Afghanistan. I guess that's another Istan we could include in our Central Asia list. The city is home to only 30,000 people. The shape of it is quite odd along the confluence of the Guni and Pani rivers. The region's altitude is quite high. The average is about 3,500 meters. Some locals call it the roof of the world. So right away, it's huge, remote, isolated, not connected to the rest of the country all that well, which already makes it feel like its own place. And something else that maybe makes it a prime candidate to be a nation of their own is the fact that they are not populated by Tajik people like the country that they belong to. The rest of the country is populated by Tajiks, the ethnic group that give their name to the country. But this region instead is home to the Pamiris, named in connection to the Pamir Mountains. They're not ethnic Tajik, not Persian speaking either, and not Sunni Muslims like the rest of the country. Instead, they speak Pamir languages or dialects, Shugni, Vaki, Rushani, and others. They're not dialects of Tajik, they're their own thing. They're separate Iranian languages. And religiously, they are different from the rest of the country too, being predominantly Ismaili Shi'a, following the Aga Khan, and culturally they have a mountain identity that's deeply tied to other local traditions. And the religious difference is quite interesting and quite important for their sense of being different from the rest of the country. Ismaili Shi'a Islam is a branch of Shia Islam that, like all Shi'ism, traces their leadership after the Prophet Muhammad through his cousin and son-in-law Ali. But while most Shia Muslims believe that the line of Imams ended in the 12th one, who is hidden and will return one day, Ismailis follow a different line of succession and believe in a living Imam, who is currently Prince Karim Aga Khan IV. The Pamiris follow this faith mostly due to their geographic isolation and the historic exposure to Ismaili missionaries across the centuries, especially during the periods where the mountainous regions were loosely connected to Persian and Central Asia cultural spheres rather than the Sunni Islamic centers that then influenced the rest of the region, especially the rest of Tajikistan in their case. And these people, the Pamir, are so much something of their own that they even have a unique flag to represent their ethnicity. This one, it's pretty cool and would, if I say so myself, make a great national flag. It's a white field with two diagonal stripes along the center, green and red. And the flag is an interesting point because it represents Pamir people as a whole, not just the ones that live in this region of Tajikistan, because they don't just live here, they are spread around the region and even around the world. Although the majority does live in Badakhshan, their total is around 350,000 people and 200,000 of those live here, but 65,000 live in Afghanistan, 50,000 in China, mostly in Xinjiang, 32 migrated to Russia, mostly living in Moscow, not even in the Central Asia part of Russia. Around 30,000 live in Pakistan, in the Gilgit-Baltistan area. There's also apparently a super small community of around 300 people in New York City, in the US. Their presence in the surrounding regions is justified by the fact that before modern Tajikistan existed, this place was part of a bigger region called Badakhshan, which also spans northern Afghanistan. In fact, today, Afghanistan itself also has a Badakhshan province within it. It's the one with the little panhandle that connects them to China. So if you're feeling that this doesn't really make sense and why would they belong to Tajikistan, it seems a little bit arbitrary, well, it was. The broader Badakhshan region, which includes Gorno-Badakhshan plus Afghan Badakhshan and parts of western China, show up in written sources for the first time in around the 7th and 8th centuries, already known for being remote, mountainous, and rich in gems, especially lapis lazuli, which was used to make blue dye throughout history. Various groups of Turkic and Hunnic people claimed control over it over time, but quite sparsely. The Arab Islamic expansion brought Islam later on, and some Persian influences too. But because the terrain is very fractured, what you get over and over throughout history are essentially valley kingdoms, nominally part of some big empire, but practically always semi-independent throughout time. With the Mongol conquest, Badakhshan actually comes out of the chaos a little more defined as a kingdom, ruled by local dynasties that claimed prestigious lineages. Some even claim descent from Alexander the Great, which I guess is a little bit of a classic Central Asia claim. From roughly the 13th and 15th centuries, the region is ruled by local mirs, which were essentially princes, but it's always in the shadow of bigger powers, first the Mongols, then the Timurids, especially with Tamerlane's empire. And from the 16th century onwards, the neighboring Uzbek moved in. In 1584, Badakhshan was conquered by them and ruled by local Uzbek mirs. In the 19th century, it got pulled to the other side into Afghan politics and became a tributary to Kabul, but its autonomy effectively ended by the 1880s. Then the modern Gorno-Badakhshan area in particular, which are essentially the western Pamirs, came under the rule of the Emirates of Kokand and then Bukhara, but with a lot of local autonomy still. And then the Russians arrived. At around this time, in the second half of the 19th century, the Russian Empire gradually extended its control over Central Asia in the 1860s and 1880s. For example, they defeated the Khanate of Kokand and the Emirate of Bukhara, making them protectorates or annexing them, and Gorno-Badakhshan came along with it. By 1895, the northern part of the territory was firmly placed in the Russian Empire's sphere of influence, and the region was an important boundary or even a border between their sphere of influence and the British sphere of influence, emanating all the way from the British Raj. For example, like I mentioned earlier on, the capital of the region today, Korog, was firmly under Russian control after a fort was built there in the 1890s. There's a little bit of a question mark about what life was like in the region during the Russian Civil War, but after the Russian Empire collapsed and after the Bolsheviks finally reasserted Russian control over Central Asia, the region was reorganized. The Pamir area was integrated into the Soviet system. In 1925, the autonomous region was created. By 1929, the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast was formally part of the new Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic. And during Soviet times, the Pamir Mountains were treated as an important border region. Infrastructure, like the famous Pamir Highway, was built. Education and development projects occurred, and this was partly to ensure loyalty and really integrate the region into the Union. But despite this autonomous label, the real power was still in Moscow and at most in the leadership of the Tajik Socialist Republic. Local elites had some advancement, but the local autonomy was very limited. When the USSR dissolved in 1991, Tajikistan became independent. Gorno-Badakhshan was carried along as part of the Tajik state, but the region's distinct identity, language, religion, and historical sense of autonomy meant that tensions were pretty quick to arise. During the Tajik Civil War, which lasted between 1992 and 97, the region was a stronghold of opposition and regionalism. Local groups demanded greater autonomy and democratic rights, and they even declared independence temporarily. And it was at this time that the main independence or separatist movement was formed. They flew this other flag, a horizontal tricolor of green, a slightly thicker white line, and black. It was founded by Pamiri intellectuals and regional leaders as a political party called Lali Badakhshan, meaning rubies of Badakhshan. Remember earlier how we found out that the earliest records of the region mentioned the rich minerals and gems that the region had? I think this is maybe a reference to that once again. Their independence declaration wasn't recognized though, and when the internal conflict ended, it was just ignored. The war ended with peace accords that nominally guaranteed some regional rights, but the central government maintained a strong authority. After this, the Lali Badakhshan party was banned, and separatism lost its formal structure, shifting instead into a more passive and identity-driven resistance. Former commanders of the movement continued to hold informal positions of power, and so their influence continued a little bit in the region, but the movement hasn't come close to achieving independence. The core grievances behind it, which are demands for autonomy and cultural recognition, remain unresolved. And so while they haven't been successful, the separatist sentiment is very much alive beneath the surface. And this brings us to today, when the autonomous label still exists, but it's much more symbolic and a remnant of the region's history. Locals did demand more control and local rule throughout time. They were heard by the central government, but mostly ignored and sometimes even repressed. This sort of summarizes the main problem, but there's two dimensions to it that I think it's important to understand. There's an economic one. Imagine living somewhere cut off by mountains most of the year. You get poor infrastructure, limited industry, and zero political power. Trade does happen, especially to China, but the money flows to Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, not to the region. And locals feel like what they're doing is providing transit routes while the state takes its revenue and they see none or very little of it. And there's also an identity aspect to this. At one point, official documents could only legally use Tajik and Russian. Pamiri languages didn't get formal recognition, which doesn't really scream inclusion. Some Pamiris feel like the government tries to Tajikify them, which is basically to say the opposite of what happens when you mean to give them autonomy. And both of these, of course, contribute to tensions rising up and help the idea of independence not fade away. There were clashes in 2012, again in 2014, 18, and most recently in 2022. It's like a cycle. Every few years tensions build, protests begin, the police and military respond harshly, then a new local leader is replaced by someone loyal to Tajikistan. Then people get angry again. So the question is, will they ever get angry enough or have the resources to turn protest into revolution? Essentially, can they actually become independent? In theory, yes, there is still a separatist movement and most importantly, a separatist sentiment within the population. There's a historical identity, they're culturally distinct and geographically isolated. And both of these help with having a unique nation-building opportunity. And also, I guess, for defense purposes. But how would this process actually go? I guess a first phase would be an escalation of local protests. Something sets it off again, maybe another heavy-handed crackdown by the central government. Korog would become a hub of protesting for the Pamirs. This actually already happened in 2022, but then they would need a second phase, a phase of de facto autonomy, when local leaders would claim regional control, start managing their own border crossings, maybe cooperate with China on trade if the central state won't, and even form their own militarized militia for protection. Phase 3 would have to come with a formal declaration of independence. Maybe they could proclaim a Pamir Republic. Tajikistan would definitely say it's illegal, they would have limited recognition internationally, possibly supported quietly by someone like China for logistical reasons, possibly opposed by the other Central Asian nations due to solidarity towards Tajikistan. But here I think we need to remember one thing. Tajikistan is the only one of these Central Asia istans that isn't a Turkic nation, and so maybe this would condition and limit the actual support that they would receive in a scenario like this. But then you have to ask, would it even survive? Well, if it had the backing of China, probably yes, but if they didn't want to just be a puppet of Beijing, they would have some big challenges on their own. First of all, Afghanistan already rules part of their region, with this tempt the Afghan government to invade and try to annex them. Then, even if they didn't, their situation isn't the best. While the isolation is good for defense and cultural difference and affirmation, it's not good for the rest. Their population is only 230,000. It's smaller than many cities. Their economic potential is pretty limited because the mountains don't really allow for much agriculture or industry. Their economy is weak. It relies heavily on state funding, limited as it may be, and outside aid. They actually get a lot of aid from the Aga Khan network because they follow that religion. Maybe this could be a new support system, and who knows, they could actually become the official country, like a holy see for this religion. If they succeeded, and there's a very, very big if here, it would be very relevant on a global scale. For one, it would set a precedent for other autonomous mountain regions across Eurasia, maybe even the ones within Russia. The trade routes between China and Central Asia could suffer a complete overhaul. It would create a new flashpoint between China itself, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and of course, Russia, who, despite not controlling the istans anymore directly, doesn't like changes that they can't control. And it really could embolden similar movements around the world, especially where Soviet-drawn borders didn't and don't match ethnic realities. So after all this explanation, a simple question. Is this going to happen? I don't know. Is it possible? Yes. Full independence right now is unlikely, but greater autonomy is very likely to be back on the table soon. And if Tajikistan doesn't respond carefully, the situation could get worse. So in the future, if you hear about this region, maybe it won't just be an autonomous area of Tajikistan, it would be a self-proclaimed Pamir Republic, or Pamiria, if we want to use a Latin suffix. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see what happens, but I would definitely like to see a new country emerge. Thank you so much for watching this video. Are there any other new countries that you know about that could potentially be created in the near future? Let me know in the comments. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.